On 21 August 1942, infantry companies from General von Seydlitz's LI Corps crossed the Don at dawn in inflatable assault boats. They rapidly established a bridgehead near the village of Luchinsky. More and more companies paddled furiously over the broad expanse of water. A few miles downstream at Vertiach, a whole battalion crossed the Don in relays in less than 70 minutes. Once bridgeheads were secured, pioneer battalions went to work building pontoon bridges to take the tanks and other vehicles of General von Wietersheim's 14th Panzer Corps. The German pioneers, intrigued by the mysterious contrasts of the quiet Don, referred to the river affectionately as the stream. A number of soldiers and officers in the 6th Army seemed to have fallen for this stretch of Don Cossack country. Some dreamed of having a farm there once the war was won. Soon after midday on 22nd August, the bridge was ready and General Hube's 16th Panzer Division, the battering ram of the Corps, began to cross. The tanks, half-tracks, self-propelled assault guns, 8-wheeled reconnaissance vehicles, and trucks rattled deafeningly over the pontoon bridge. That night, as soon as the moon rose, Russian aircraft began their bombing runs. Vehicles were hit on both banks and they burned brightly, illuminating the target area, but the bombs continued to miss the bridge itself. Hube's divisional headquarters received reports of skirmishes around the edges of the bridgehead. From time to time, the shrieking whoosh of Katyusha rockets from Stalin organs could be heard. The sound was unsettling, but the enemy batteries were firing blind. Behind the infantry screen, the lagered panzer troops made final checks on their vehicles or caught up on a little sleep. At 0430 hours, as the dawn rose ahead of them in the east, Count von Strackwitz's Abteilung of the 2nd Panzer Regiment, reinforced with Panzer Grenadier companies, moved forward towards the Volga. The tank crews, conscious of the historic event, found it a very exhilarating moment. The steppe between the Don and Volga, stone-hard in the summer drought, offered fast going. Tank commanders, standing in their turrets, wearing goggles against the dust, had to keep an eye ahead for a hidden balka or gully that might not be visible to the driver. For the first dozen miles, the panzer crews sighted few enemy. The slightly rolling terrain of dry, rough grass seemed eerily empty. The sun had still not risen high in the sky when General Hube, after a flurry of radio transmissions, suddenly halted his headquarters. Engines were switched off to conserve fuel. They waited in the baking heat. Soon the droning of a small airplane could be heard. A Fieseler Storch liaison aircraft appeared. It circled, then came in to land alongside the armored vehicles. The pilot climbed out and strode over. It was General von Richthofen. Richthofen, now commander-in-chief of the 4th Air Fleet, hardly bothered to conceal his mood of impatience with the army. General Paulus is worried about his left flank, he had noted in his diary only 3 days before. He was also displeased when told that the Luftwaffe's main priority was to shoot up tanks. For fighter pilots, ground attack was regarded as menial and unnecessarily dangerous. One German pilot, after his aircraft was hit by one of the women's anti-aircraft batteries, managed to bail out, but when his parachute opened, he drifted straight down into a blaze. Those citizens of Stalingrad who saw his end were so shocked by the onslaught around that even the satisfaction of poetic justice was beyond them. The huge petroleum storage tanks on the Volga bank were also hit. A ball of flame rose about 1,500 feet into the sky, and over the following days the column of black smoke could be seen from over 200 miles away. Blazing oil spread across the Volga. Bombs destroyed the telephone exchange and waterworks, and the main Stalingrad hospital was straddled by a stick of bombs. Windows were blasted in, and children hurled from their beds. They included Nina Grebenikova, the 14-year-old whose spine had been broken a week before by the bomb which fell near the petroleum storage tanks. The attack on the hospital so terrorized members of the staff that they ran away, abandoning their patients, some of whom were left for 5 days without food or care. One mother, caught in the open with a daughter whose legs froze in shell shock, literally had to drag her home through the bombing. No driver would attempt the journey. With virtually all the fathers away at the front or now mobilized, women were left to cope with the appalling aftermath. Viktor Goncharov's wife, helped by her 11-year-old son, Nikolai, buried her father's corpse in the yard of their apartment block, which had received a direct hit. Before filling in the grave, the son remembered, "We searched for his head, but could not find it." Her mother-in-law, Goncharova, the wife of the Cossack veteran, was lost in the chaos. Somehow the old woman managed to live through the battle to come, surviving for just over 5 months in a bunker. They did not find each other again until the end of the war, nearly 3 years later. The aerial assault on Stalingrad, the most concentrated on the Ostfront, represented the natural culmination of Richthofen's career since Guernica. 4th Air Fleet aircraft flew a total of 1,600 sorties that day and dropped 1,000 tons of bombs for the loss of only 3 machines. According to some estimates, there had been nearly 600,000 people in Stalingrad, and 40,000 were killed during the first week of bombardment. The reason why so many citizens and refugees still remained on the west bank of the Volga was typical of the regime. The NKVD had commandeered almost all rivercraft, while allotting a very low priority to evacuating the civil population. Then Stalin, deciding that no panic must...
Red Army aviation regiments were also thrown into the battle on 24 August, but a Yak stood little chance against a Messerschmitt 109, and the Sturlovik fighter bombers, although armored underneath, were extremely vulnerable when tailed by a competent pilot. German soldiers cheered from below when Luftwaffe pilots dispatched their enemy mit Eleganz, as if the air war was a sort of bullfight conducted for the pleasure of spectators on the ground. German bombing raids on the city continued, with another major air attack on the afternoon of 25 August. The power station at Beketova was badly damaged, but soon repaired. Otherwise, Luftwaffe squadrons continued pulverizing the length of the city. Many people lost all their possessions, but families spontaneously shared whatever they had left. They knew well that the next day they might find themselves in the same state, and nothing reduced the notion of private property more rapidly than such destruction from the sky. Permission was at last given to allow Stalingrad women and children to cross to the East Bank on the NKVD's commandeered craft. Only a few steamers were spared, however, because most were needed for evacuating wounded and bringing back ammunition and reinforcements. The journey was certainly as hazardous as remaining on the West Bank, because the Luftwaffe continued to attack boats crossing the Volga. The ferry jetty, upstream of the Tsaritsa Gorge, was hit again, and the Shanghai restaurant, just above it, a favorite peacetime meeting place in a strip of park on top of the riverbank, was burned to a shell. The families crossing saw blackened bodies floating past like charred logs, and patches of the river still burned with oil from the storage tanks. The children from the hospital, including Nina Grebennikova, tied to a stretcher, were moved across the Volga on 28 August and taken to a field hospital on the East Bank. The guns of 16th Panzer Division had also been at work since that first Sunday evening, announcing their presence on the Volga by sinking a freight steamer and shelling a gunboat. They also shelled the railway ferry, leaving a tangle of burnt and destroyed carriages, and over the next few days sank 7 rivercraft. The tank crews claimed them as gunboats and did not seem to realize that they might be evacuating civilians. On their third evening, German panzers sank a paddle steamer taking women and children from the city to the East Bank. Hearing screams and cries for help, soldiers asked their commander if they could use some of the pioneers' inflatable boats to rescue them, but the lieutenant refused.
"We know how the enemy fights this war," he replied. After night had fallen, the panzer crews pulled their blankets up over their heads so that they did not hear the cries anymore. Some women managed to swim to the west bank, but most swam to a sandbank where they stayed the whole next day. The Germans did not fire when they were evacuated the next night, as proof that they were different from the Russians. We wouldn't hinder such a thing. Behind the foremost German positions on the Volga bank was a sort of semi-cultivated parkland with oaks, walnut trees, sweet chestnut, and oleanders, bordered by allotments with melons, tomatoes, vines, and fruit trees. There the advance units of 16th Panzer Division dug in, using the vegetation for cover. The Pioneer Battalion's headquarters was hidden under a large pear tree. During lulls in the firing, panzer crews and combat engineers picked ripe fruit, using caps and helmets as baskets. After the weeks of desiccated steppe, to gaze upon the broad Volga, like a calm lake, somehow intensified the sensation of having reached the end of their journey to the frontier of Europe. It seemed such a pity that the Russians continued to resist. Soldiers, at the very first opportunity, wrote home from the Volga, proud.
On 27th August, the first rain for 5 weeks fell. But the real cause for delay to Hoth's right flank had come from the resistance put up by Soviet troops around Lake Sarpa and near Tundutovo in the hills south of the Volga Bend below Stalingrad. That day, for example, the Penal Company attached to the 91st Rifle Division repulsed numerous attacks by superior enemy forces. The political department of Stalingrad Front later reported to Shcherbakov, "Many men have compensated for their faults with bravery and should be rehabilitated and returned to their regiments." But once again, most of them died long before anything was done. The advance went better 2 days later when Hoth suddenly switched 48th Panzer Corps over to the left flank out in the Kalmyk steppe. The German Army's chief advantage lay in the close cooperation of the Panzer Division and the Luftwaffe. In the constantly changing battle, German infantrymen used the red flag with swastika as identification panels on the ground to ensure they were not bombed by their own aircraft. But the real danger of Stukas attacking their own ground forces by mistake came in fast-moving armored operations. Lieutenant Max Plakolb, the commander of a small Luftwaffe forward air control section, was attached to the headquarters of 24th Panzer Division. At this time, when 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions and 29th Motorized Infantry Division were starting to swing round the southwest of Stalingrad, Plakolb settled himself at the radio. The point units of 24th Panzer Division had advanced much faster than the neighboring division, and Plakolb suddenly overheard on his radio a contact report: concentration of enemy vehicles. The pilot then proceeded to give 24th Panzer Division's position. With the greatest alarm, since the Stukas were approaching, Plakolb called up the squadron himself, using the code word Bonzo, and persuaded them to abort their attack just in time. So rapid was the advance of 48th Panzer Corps from the south that by the evening of 31st August, its point units had reached the Stalingrad-Morozov railway line. Suddenly, it looked as if an opportunity of cutting off the remnants of Soviet 62nd and 64th Armies had appeared. Paulus's infantry divisions, slowly advancing eastwards from the Don, could never have gotten round the Russian rear. The only chance was to send 14th Panzer Corps down from the Rinok corridor to seal the trap, as Army Group Headquarters strongly urged. This represented a considerable gamble, and Paulus decided against the plan. Hube would have had to turn his ill-supplied panzers round, break off the running battles, and ignore the enemy armies then massing just to the north. Yeremenko, alerted to the danger, pulled his remaining forces back out of the trap. In some cases, the retreat was dictated by panic rather than design. In 64th Army, the crews of Anti-Aircraft Battery 748 ran away, abandoning their guns.
This incident rapidly became a case of conspiracy in the ever-suspicious eyes of commissars, with the allegation that a member of the battery then led a battalion of German submachine gunners in an attack against the neighboring 204th Rifle Division. On Paulus's northern flank, 14th Panzer.
On 1st September, he ordered the reconnaissance company to go off in groups of 10 to find out where the Germans were. With soldiers mounted on local horses, they moved southwards across the Stalingrad-Saratov railway line. The division followed in a mass. Suddenly, German aircraft returning from a raid on the city sighted the advancing force. Some twin-engined Messerschmitt nose planes peeled off to strafe them, while the other aircraft returned to base to bomb up again. They came back at around midday, but by then the division had deployed and the tempting target was dispersed. The reconnaissance groups returned, having sighted some German units, but they were unable to draw a front line for their commander. It simply did not exist in a recognizable form. The Russian commanders were worried and angry. Although their infantry greatly outnumbered the Germans facing them, none of their tanks, no artillery, and few of their anti-tank guns had arrived. The situation proved even more disastrous for 64th Rifle Division, which was assembling to the rear. Morale collapsed under German air attacks, which also destroyed its field hospital, killing many doctors and nurses. The wounded, being taken to the rear, recounted tales of horror, which unnerved the inexperienced troops waiting in reserve to be marched forward. On 1st September, he ordered the reconnaissance company to go off in groups of 10 to find out where the Germans were. With soldiers mounted on local horses, they moved southwards across the Stalingrad-Saratov railway line. The division followed in a mass. Suddenly, German aircraft returning from a raid on the city sighted the advancing force. Some twin-engined Messerschmitt nose planes peeled off to strafe them, while the other aircraft returned to base to bomb up again. They came back at around midday, but by then the division had deployed and the tempting target was dispersed. The reconnaissance groups returned, having sighted some German units, but they were unable to draw a front line for their commander. It simply did not exist in a recognizable form. The Russian commanders were worried and angry. Although their infantry greatly outnumbered the Germans facing them, none of their tanks, no artillery, and few of their anti-tank guns had arrived. The situation proved even more disastrous for 64th Rifle Division, which was assembling to the rear. Morale collapsed under German air attacks, which also destroyed its field hospital, killing many doctors and nurses. The wounded, being taken to the rear, recounted tales of horror, which unnerved the inexperienced troops waiting in reserve to be marched forward. Individuals, then whole groups began to desert. The divisional commander ordered the most fragile units to form up. He harangued and cursed them for such a cowardly failure to serve the motherland. He then adopted the Roman punishment of decimation. With pistol drawn, he walked along the front rank, counting in a loud voice. He shot every 10th man through the face at point-blank range until his magazine was empty. Zhukov, having just been appointed Deputy Supreme Commander, second only to Stalin, had arrived in Stalingrad on 29 August to oversee operations. He soon discovered that the 3 armies earmarked for the operations were ill-armed, manned by older reservists and short of ammunition, as well as artillery. On the scrambler line to Moscow, he persuaded Stalin that the attack must be delayed by a week. Stalin agreed, but the German advance to the western edge of the city, now that Sidlitz's corps had linked up with 4th Panzer Army, alarmed him again on 3rd September. He rang General Vasilevsky, the Chief of Staff, demanding to know the exact position.
As soon as Vasilevsky admitted that German tanks had reached the suburbs, his exasperation with Zhukov and other generals exploded. What's the matter with them? Don't they understand that if we surrender Stalingrad, the south of the country will be cut off from the center and will probably not be able to defend it? Don't they realize that this is not only a catastrophe for Stalingrad? We would lose our main waterway and soon our oil too? We are putting everything that can fight into the places on.
Time is blood. The September battles. The first time the German people heard of the city of Stalingrad as a military objective was in a communiqué of 20th August. Just over 2 weeks later, Hitler, who had never wanted his troops to become involved in street fighting in Moscow or Leningrad, became determined to seize this city at any price. Events on the Caucasus front, supposedly his main priority, played a major part in his new obsession with Stalingrad. On 7th September, a day when Haider noted satisfying progress at Stalingrad, Hitler's exasperation at the failure to advance in the Caucasus came to a head. He refused to accept that Field Marshal List did not have enough troops for the task. General Alfred Jodl, having just returned from a visit to List's headquarters, observed at dinner that List had only followed the Führer's orders. "That is a lie," screamed Hitler, and stormed out. As if to prove that he had been misquoted, instructions were sent back to Germany by teleprinter, ordering Reichstag stenographers to be sent to Vinnitsa to take down every word at the daily situation conference. After the triumphs in Poland, Scandinavia, and France, Hitler was often ready to despise mundane requirements such as fuel supplies and manpower shortages, as if he were above the normal material constraints of war. His explosion on this occasion appears to have brought him to a sort of psychological frontier. General Warlimont, who returned after a week's absence, was so shocked by Hitler's long stare of burning hate that he thought, "This man has lost face. He has realized that his fatal gamble is over, that Soviet Russia is not going to be beaten in this second attempt." Nikolaus von Below, the Führer's Luftwaffe adjutant, also returned to find a completely new situation. The whole of Hitler's entourage made a uniformly depressing impression. Hitler suddenly was completely withdrawn. Hitler probably did sense the truth. He had, after all, told his generals that a failure to take the Caucasus would mean having to end the war, but he still could not accept it. The Volga was cut, and Stalingrad's war industries as good as destroyed, both of the objectives defined in Operation Blue. Yet he now had to capture the city which bore Stalin's name, as though this in itself would achieve the subjugation of the enemy by other means. The dangerous dreamer had turned to symbolic victory for compensation. 1 or 2 spectacular successes remained to sustain the illusion that Stalingrad would be the crucible in which to prove the superiority of German might. In continued fighting on the North Front, Count von Strachwitz, the star commander of 16th Panzer Division, had shown that in a prolonged tank battle, success depended on a cool head, straight aim, and rapidity of fire. The Russians sent in wave after wave of T-34s and Lend-Lease American tanks. The American vehicles, with their higher profile and thinner protection, proved easy to knock out. Their Soviet crews did not like them. "The tanks are no good," a driver told his captors. "The valves go to pieces, the engine overheats, and the transmission is no use." The Russians attacked over a hill, recalled Freitag von Lorenhoven, and we were on the reverse slope. Over 2 days they kept coming exactly the same way, exposing themselves on the skyline. More than 100 were destroyed. "As far as the eye could see," a pioneer corporal wrote home, "there were countless shot up and burned out tanks." The 49-year-old Strachwitz received the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross and was posted back to Germany.
The morning after General Zhukov received a summons to the new headquarters at Yami of the Joint Military Council for the Stalingrad and Southwestern fronts. It took him all day and most of the night to cross the Volga and find the spot. The glow from the blazing buildings in Stalingrad was so strong that even on the east bank of the broad Volga, there was no need to switch on the headlights of his Lend-Lease Jeep. When Chukov finally saw Khrushchev and Yeremenko the next morning, they stated the situation. The Germans were prepared to take the city at any price. There could be no surrender. There was nowhere to retreat to. Chukov had been proposed as the new army commander in Stalingrad. "Comrade Chukov," said Khrushchev, "how do you interpret your task?" "We will defend the city or die in the attempt," he replied. Yeremenko and Khrushchev looked at him and said that he had understood his task correctly. That evening, Chukov crossed by a ferryboat from Krasnaya Sloboda along with 2 T-34 tanks to the central landing stage just above the Tsaritsa Gorge. As the craft approached the bank, hundreds of people, mainly civilians hoping to escape, emerged silently from shell craters. Others prepared to carry the wounded on board. Chukov and his companions set off to find his headquarters. After many false directions, the commissar of a sapper unit took them to the Mamayev Kurgan, the huge Tartar burial mound, also known as Hail 102 from its height in meters. There, Chukov found 62nd Army headquarters and met his chief of staff, General Nikolai Ivanovich Krylov. The harsh and blunt Chukov was very different from Krylov, a precise man with an analytical mind, yet the two understood each other and the situation. There was only one way to hold on. They had to pay in lives. Time is blood, as Chukov put it later, with brutal simplicity. Supported by Krylov and Kuzma Akimovich Gurov, the sinister-looking army commissar with a shaven head and thick eyebrows, Chukov began to instill terror into any commander who even contemplated the idea of retreat. Some senior officers had started to slip back over the river, abandoning their men, most of whom, as Chukov realized, also wanted to get across the Volga as quickly as possible, away from this hell. He made sure that NKVD troops controlled every landing stage and jetty. Deserters, whatever their rank, faced summary execution. There were many other alarming reports about the reliability of troops. Earlier that day, in 6th Guards Tank Brigade, a senior sergeant killed his company commander, then threatened the driver and radio operator with his pistol. As soon as they were out of the tank, he drove it off toward the lines of the German 76th Infantry Division. Because the sergeant had a white flag ready to stick out of the turret, the investigators concluded that this experienced traitor had planned all the details of his disgusting plot. The 2 soldiers forced out of the tank at gunpoint were deemed to have displayed cowardice. Both faced the military tribunal later and were probably shot. At that stage, 62nd Army was reduced to some 20,000 men. It had fewer than 60 tanks left. Many were only good for immobile fire points. Chukov, however, had 700 mortars and guns, and he wanted all the heavier artillery to be withdrawn to the east bank. His main preoccupation,
Although the Germans made progress into the western edge of the city, capturing the small airfield and barracks, their attempts to batter in the northern bulge proved unsuccessful. The fighting was much harder than expected. Many privately realized that they might well be spending the winter in Stalingrad. Chukov decided to move during that night to the former headquarters tunnel, which ran in from the Tsaritsa Gorge and had a rear exit up into Pushkinskaya Ulitsa, a street close to the Volga bank. The line of the Tsaritsa Gorge had also been the obvious choice for Paulus and Hoth as the boundary between their 2 armies. While Seydlitz's divisions to the north pushed towards the Mamayev Kurgan and the main railway station,
Hoth's 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions and the 94th Infantry Division to the south advanced ready to strike towards the rectangular concrete grain elevator which dominated the Stalingrad skyline. News of the 71st Infantry Division's advance into the center of Stalingrad, just north of the Zaritsa, was greeted with fierce exultation at Führer headquarters. The same information reached the Kremlin that evening. Stalin was discussing the possibility of a great strategic counterstroke at Stalingrad with Zhukov and Vasilevsky, when Poskrebyshev, the chief of his secretariat, entered to say that Yeremenko was on the telephone. After speaking with him, Stalin told the two generals the news. Yeremenko says the enemy is bringing up tank forces near the city. He expects an attack tomorrow. He turned to Vasilevsky. Issue orders immediately for Rodmintsev's 13th Guards Rifle Division to cross the Volga and see what else you can send over. An hour later, Zhukov was on an aeroplane back to Stalingrad. In the early hours of 14 September, Zhukov and his staff made their way southwards through the destroyed city to the Zaritsa bunker in two vehicles. The rubble-strewn streets were only just passable, and their short journey was frequently delayed. Zhukov was impatient because he had ordered a counterattack and needed to be ready in the new headquarters. His troops surprised the Germans in several places, but they were smashed back at sunrise as soon as the Luftwaffe Stuka squadrons became operational. The only encouraging news he received that morning was that the 13th Guards Rifle Division would cross the river that night. But the enemy advances that day were so strong and rapid that many began to doubt whether Rodmintsev's troops would manage to land on the west bank. The German 295th Infantry Division fought its way to the far slope of the Mamayev Kurgan, but the most immediate threat to Stalingrad's survival came just to their south. Both divisions, 71st and 76th, managed to advance with an attacking wedge to the central station at midday, and 3:15 p.m., with the waterworks captured, they reached the bank of the Volga. The main station, in fact, changed hands 3 times in 2 hours in the morning and was retaken by an NKVD rifle battalion in the afternoon. General Alexander Rodmintsev's uniform was filthy by the time he reached Zhukov's headquarters early that afternoon. Ever since he had set foot on the west bank of the Volga, the constant air attacks had forced him. Another unpleasant encounter took place that evening. Across the Volga, Stalin's civilian delegate, Georgy Malenkov, had summoned the senior officers of the 8th Air Army to front headquarters. They thought, as they came in, that they must have been called there to receive medals. Yeremenko and Zhukov stood in the background. Malenkov, who on the first day of the war had disbelieved Admiral Kuznetsov's report of the German air raid on Sevastopol, now turned his displeasure on the officers of Red Army aviation. He demanded to know which units had been in action on which days, and then accused them of insufficient activity. He dictated court-martial sentences for the commanders. To make the point of his power, he called forward one officer, a short major with dark brushed-back hair and a face which was rather puffy from self-indulgence. "Major Stalin," he said to the son of Yosef Vissarionovich, "the combat performance of your flyers is revolting. In the last battle, not one of your 24 fighters shot down a single German. What is it? Did you forget how to fight? How are we to understand this?" Malenkov then humiliated General Khrukin, the commander of the 8th Air Army. Only the intervention of Zhukov brought the proceedings to a close. He reminded them that Rodimtsev's division was about to cross the Volga. The fighter regiment responsible for covering them had better make sure that not a single German bomb was allowed to fall. The aviation officers filed out, too shaken to speak. The Stavka had ordered the 13th Guards Rifle Division forward to Stalingrad 3 days before. Although over 10,000 men strong, a tenth of them had no weapons. The division was dispersed away from the site of German air reconnaissance under the elms, Ukrainian poplars, and willows of the east bank around Krasnaya Sloboda. They were given little time to prepare after the journey south from Kamyashin. Rodimtsev, knowing the urgency, had harried his commanders all the way. Truck radiators had boiled over, the pack camels had been nervous, and the dust raised by vehicles had been so thick that the kites perched on the telegraph poles became gray. On several occasions, the troops had scattered when yellow-nosed Messerschmitts screamed in at low level to strafe their columns. As they had approached the Volga, the parched, dusty steppe ended, with maple trees announcing the nearness of water. An arrowed sign nailed to a tree bore the single word, ferry. Soldiers caught sight of the heavy black smoke ahead and nudged their neighbors in the ranks. It had been the first indication of the battle which awaited them on the far side of the great river. On the riverbank, they were rapidly issued with ammunition, grenades, and rations, bread, sausage, and also sugar for their brew-ups. Rodimtsev, after his meeting with Chuikov, decided not to wait until darkness had completely fallen. The first wave of guardsmen were rushed forward in the twilight to a mixture of gunboats from the Volga flotilla and commandeered civilian craft, tugs, pinnaces, barges, fishing barks, even rowing boats. Those left to wait their turn on the eastern bank tried to calculate how long it would be before the boats returned for them. The crossing was probably most eerie for those in the rowing boats, as the water gently slapped the bow and the rowlocks creaked in unison. The distant crack of rifle shots and the thump of shell bursts sounded hollow over the expanse of river.
The struggle became intense for the Mamayev Kurgan. If the Germans took it, their guns could control the Volga. One of the NKVD rifle regiments managed to retain a small part of the hill until reinforced by the remainder of Rodimtsev's 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment and part of another division just before dawn on September 16th. The new arrivals attacked the summit and shoulders of the hill early that morning. The Mamayev Kurgan was now completely unrecognizable from the park where lovers had strolled a few weeks before. Not a blade of glass remained on the ground, now sown with shell, bomb, and grenade fragments. The whole hillside had been churned and pocked with craters which served as instant trenches in the bitter fighting of attack and counterattack. Guardsman Kentia achieved fame by tearing down the German flag erected at the summit by soldiers of the 295th Infantry Division and trampling on it. Much less was heard of unheroic episodes. A Russian battery commander on the Mamayev Kurgan was said to have deserted because he was afraid of being held responsible for his cowardice during the battle. The gun crews had panicked and run away when a group of German infantry broke through and attacked the battery. Senior Lieutenant M had displayed indecisiveness and had failed to kill Germans, a capital offense at such a time. At 11 o'clock on the night of September 16th, Lieutenant K, a platoon commander in the 112th Rifle Division, some 5 miles to the north, discovered the absence of 4 soldiers and their NCO. Instead of taking measures to find them and stop this act of treason, all he did was report the fact to his company commander. At about 1 a.m., Commissar Kolobanov went to the platoon to investigate. As he approached its trenches, he heard a voice call in Russian from the German positions, addressing individual soldiers in the platoon by name and urging them to cross over. "You should all desert. They'll feed you well and treat you well. On the Russian side, you'll die whatever happens." The commissar then noticed several figures crossing no man's land towards the German side. To his fury, other members of the platoon did not fire at them. He found that 10 men, including the sergeant, had gone. The platoon commander was arrested and court-martialed. His sentence, presumably either execution or a Strafkompanie, is not recorded. In the same division, a captain apparently tried to persuade 2 other officers to desert with him, but one of them did not agree and executed the traitor.
but one cannot be sure that this version of events was not camouflaging a personal argument. The Germans counterattacked again and again over the following days, but Radimtsev's guardsmen and the remnants of the NKVD Rifle Regiment managed to hold on to the Mamayev Kurgan. The 295th Infantry Division was fought to a standstill. Their losses were so heavy that companies were merged. Officer casualties were particularly high, largely due to Russian snipers. After less than 2 weeks in the line, a company in Colonel Korfaz's regiment of the 295th Infantry Division was on its third commander, a young lieutenant. Skirmishes to the death continued on the Mamayev Kurgan, and German heavy artillery continued to bombard Soviet positions for the next 2 months. The writer Vasily Grossman observed the shells throw the soil high into the air. These clouds of earth then passed through the sieve of gravity, the heavier lumps falling straight to the ground, the dust rising into the sky. Corpses from the battle on its blackened slopes would disinterred and then buried again in the ceaseless, churning shell fire. Years after the war, a German soldier and a Russian soldier are said to have been uncovered during clearance work. The 2 corpses had apparently been buried by a shell burst just after they had bayoneted each other to death. In Zhukov's deliberate understatement, these were very difficult days for Stalingrad. In Moscow, U.S. embassy officials were certain that the city was finished, and the mood in the Kremlin was extremely nervous. On the evening of September 16th, just after dinner, Poskrebyshev came inside.
The 50-odd defenders fought off 10 assaults on 18 September. Knowing that they could not expect resupply, they conserved their ammunition, rations, and water carefully. The conditions in which they continued to fight over the next 2 days were terrible. They were choked with dust and smoke. Even the grain in the elevator had caught fire, and they soon had almost nothing left to drink. They were also short of water to fill the barrel jackets of the Maxim machine guns. Presumably the Marines resorted to their own urine for the purpose, as was so often the practice in the First World War, but Soviet accounts avoid such details. All their grenades and anti-tank projectiles had been expended by the time more German tanks arrived to finish them off on 20th September. Both Maxims were put out of action. The defenders, unable to see inside the elevator for smoke and dust, communicated by shouting to each other through parched throats. When the Germans broke in, they fired at sounds, not at objects. That night, with only a handful of ammunition left, the survivors broke out. The wounded had to be left behind. Although a fierce fight, it was hardly an impressive victory for the Germans, yet Paulus chose the huge grain silo as the symbol of Stalingrad in the arm badge he was having designed at Army headquarters to commemorate the victory. Similarly stubborn defenses of semi-fortified buildings in the center of the town cost the Germans many men during those days. These garrisons of Red Army soldiers from different divisions held out defiantly, also suffering terribly from thirst and hunger. There was a violent battle for possession of the Uniform department store on Red Square, which served as the headquarters of the 1st Battalion of the 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment. A small warehouse, known as the Nail Factory, formed another redoubt, and in a 3-story building not far away, guardsmen fought on for 5 days, their noses and parched throats filled with brick dust from pulverized walls. Their wounded died in the cellars, untended once their young nurse succumbed to a chest wound. 6 men, out of what had originally been close to half a battalion, escaped in the last moments when German tanks finally smashed in the walls. Of the German gains in the center of the city, the most serious for the Red Army was their advance to the central landing stage. This enabled them to strike at the main nighttime crossing points with artillery, Nebelwerfer launchers, and machine guns, firing by the light of magnesium parachute flares. They were determined to stop reinforcements and supplies from reaching the defenders.
The main station, having changed hands 15 times in 5 days, ended with the Germans as occupants of the ruins. Radamchev, in agreement with Chuikov's policy, ordered that the front line was always to be within 50 yards of the Germans to make it hard for their artillery and aviation. The men of his division took a special pride in their marksmanship. Each guard soldier shot like a sniper, and thus forced the Germans to crawl, not to walk. German soldiers, red-eyed with exhaustion from the hard fighting and mourning more comrades than they ever imagined, had lost the triumphalist mood of just a week before. Everything seemed disturbingly different. They found artillery fire far more frightening in a city. The shell burst itself was not the only danger. Whenever a tall building was hit, shrapnel and masonry showered from above. The Lancer had already lost track of time in this alien world with the destroyed landscape of ruins and rubble. Even the midday light had a strange, ghostly quality from the constant haze of dust. In such a concentrated area, a soldier had to become more conscious of war in 3 dimensions, with the danger of snipers in tall buildings. He also needed to watch the sky. When Luftwaffe strikes went in, a Lancer hugged the ground in exactly the same way as a Russian. There was always the fear of Stukas failing to see the red, white, and black swastika flags laid out to identify their positions. Often they fired recognition flares to underline the point. Russian bombers also came in low, certainly low enough to reveal the red star on the tailplane. Higher up in the sky, fighters twinkled in the sun. One observer noticed that they twisted and turned more like fish in the sea than birds in the air. Noise assailed their nerves constantly. "The air is filled," wrote a panzer officer, "with the infernal howling of diving Stukas, the thunder of flak and artillery, the roar of engines, the rattle of tank tracks, the shriek of the launcher and Stalin organ, the chatter of submachine guns back and forth, and all the time one feels the heat of a city burning at every point." The screams of the wounded affected men most. The Furman, German, and Romanian armies on the southern flank, the war in the steppe was essentially like the First World War, only with better weapons and the occasional appearance of modern aircraft. For the armored formations out on both flanks, the sun-baked plains, over which they had charged like warships at full speed just weeks before, now struck them as deeply depressing. The lack of trees and mountains made southern Germans and Austrians homesick. The rains of the Rasputitsa produced squalid conditions. Soldiers in dugouts, listening to the rain and watching the level of water rise above their ankles, had little to do but think about trench foot and observe sodden rats chewing corpses in no man's land. Reconnaissance patrols, raids, and probing attacks offered the only activity on both sides. Small groups crept forward to the enemy line, then hurled grenades forward into the trenches. The only change came on 25th September, when 51st and 57th Armies attacked the Romanian division south of Stalingrad, along the line of salt lakes, and pushed them back, but it did not succeed in diverting German divisions from the city. Fighting in Stalingrad itself could not have been more different. It represented a new form of warfare, concentrated in the ruins of civilian life. The detritus of war, burnt-out tanks, shell casings, signal wire, and grenade boxes, was mixed with the wreckage of family homes, iron bedsteads, lamps, and household utensils. Vasily Grossman wrote of the fighting in the brick-strewn, half-demolished rooms and corridors of apartment blocks, where there might still be a vase of withered flowers or a boy's homework open on the table. In an observation post, high in a ruined building, an artillery spotter with a periscope might watch for targets through a convenient shell hole in the wall, seated on a kitchen chair. German infantrymen loathed house-to-house fighting. They found such close-quarter combat, which broke conventional military boundaries and dimensions, psychologically disorienting. In the last phase of the September battles, both sides had struggled to take a large brick warehouse on the Volga bank near the mouth of the Tsaritsa, which had 4 floors on the riverside and 3 on the landward. At one point, it was like a layered cake, with Germans on the top floor, Russians below them, and more Germans underneath them. Often an enemy was unrecognizable, with every uniform impregnated by the same dun-colored dust. German generals do not seem to have imagined what awaited their divisions in the ruined city. They lost their great blitzkrieg advantages and were in many ways thrown back to First World War techniques, even though their military theorists had argued that trench warfare had been an aberration in the art of war. The Sixth Army, for example, found itself having to respond to Soviet tactics by reinventing the storm wedges introduced in January 1918. Assault groups of 10 men, armed with a machine gun, light mortar, and flamethrowers for clearing bunkers, cellars, and sewers.
A more general tactic evolved based on the realization that the German armies were short of reserves. Chuikov ordered an emphasis on night attacks, mainly for the practical reason that the Luftwaffe could not react to them, but also because he was convinced that the Germans were more frightened during the hours of darkness and would become exhausted. The German Lancer came to harbor a special fear of the Siberians from Colonel Batuk's 284th Rifle Division, who were considered to be natural hunters of any sort of prey. "If only you could understand what terror is," a German soldier wrote in a letter captured by the Russians. "At the slightest rustle, I pull the trigger and fire off tracer bullets in bursts from the machine gun." The compulsion to shoot at anything that moved at night, often setting off fusillades from equally nervous sentries down a whole sector, undoubtedly contributed to the German expenditure of over 25 million rounds during the month of September alone. The Russians also kept up the tension by firing flares into the night sky from time to give the impression of an imminent attack. Red Army aviation, partly to avoid the Messerschmitts by day, kept up a relentless series of raids every night on German positions. It also served as another part of the wearing down process to exhaust the Germans and stretch their nerves. The only article of battle phrase, surviving files, to cases of battle stress, German medical authorities tended to use the euphemism of exhaustion, like the British, but their prescription was closer to the brutal simplicity of the Red Army. The German army had refused to even acknowledge its existence. In 1926, nearly 7 years before Hitler took power, war neurosis was simply abolished as a condition, along with the pension that had gone with it. Take away the disease, went the argument, and you take away the reason for leaving the front line. Breakdown was classified as cowardice and therefore could be a capital offense. It is thus impossible to say what proportion of disciplinary offenses on either side at Stalingrad, especially desertion, was caused by battle shock and general strain. All one can be certain about from studies of comparable situations is that the rate of battle shock casualties must have started to rise sharply in September, as soon as the war of movement turned into a war of virtually stationary annihilation. Psychological casualties would have started to soar if one goes by British studies of battle shock cases at Anzio and Normandy, as soon as troops were pinned down or surrounded. Chuikov's main disagreement with senior officers at front headquarters concerned the positioning of divisional, army, and front artillery regiments. Eventually, he won the argument that they should be based on the east bank of the Volga because there was simply not enough room for them with his troops on the west bank. It would have also been increasingly difficult to transport sufficient supplies of artillery shells across the Volga, and in Stalingrad, a field gun was nothing without shells. "One house taken by the Russians, one taken by the Germans," scribbled Vasily Grossman in his notebook just after his arrival. How can heavy artillery be used in such a battle? He soon discovered the answer. Soviet artillery massed on the far side of the Volga, as Chuikov. Another weapon, often as dangerous to the user as to its intended victims, was the flamethrower, which was effectively terrifying when clearing sewer tunnels, cellars, and inaccessible hiding places. The operator knew that as soon as the enemy sighted him, he would be the first target for their bullets. Red Army soldiers enjoyed inventing gadgets to kill Germans. New booby traps were dreamed up, each seemingly more ingenious and unpredictable in its results than the last. Angered at their inability to fight back against the Stuka attacks, Captain Ilgachkin, a battalion commander, decided with one of his soldiers, Private Ripa, to construct their own form of anti-aircraft gun. They fastened an anti-tank rifle to the spokes of a cartwheel, which in turn was mounted on a tall stake driven into the ground. Ilgachkin made complicated calculations on the basis of the gun's muzzle velocity and the estimated speed of a diving aircraft, but whether the gaunt and melancholy Ripa paid much attention to these figures is another matter. In any case, their contraption achieved a certain success, with Ripa managing to bring down 3 Stukas. The real anti-aircraft batteries also amended their tactics. The Stukas came over at an altitude of between 4,000 and 5,000 feet, then half-rolled to drop into a dive at an angle of about 70 degrees, their sirens screaming. They came out of the dive at just under 2,000 feet. Anti-aircraft gunners learned to put up a curtain of fire to hit them either at the point of going into the dive or at the point of coming out. Shooting at them on the way down was a waste of ammunition. Another device was dreamed up by Vasily Ivanovich Zaitsev, who soon became the most famous sniper in the Stalingrad Army. Zaitsev attached the telescopic sight from his sniper's rifle to an anti-tank gun to take on machine gun nests by slotting a shell right through their loophole. But he soon found that the charges in the mass-produced shells were not consistent enough for precision shooting. Fame could be achieved even with conventional weapons. Bizdiko, the ace mortarman in Bachuk's division, was renowned for having achieved 6 bombs in the air at the same time. These stories were exploited in an attempt to spread a cult of the expert to every soldier. The 62nd Army's slogan was, "Look after your weapon as carefully as your eyes." The garrisons holding the fortified buildings so central to Chukov's strategy, who included young women medical orderlies or signalers, suffered great privations when cut off for days at a time. They had to endure dust, smoke, hunger, and worst of all, thirst. The city had been without fresh water since the pumping station was destroyed in the August raids. Knowing the consequences of drinking polluted water, desperate soldiers shot at drain pipes in the hope of extracting a few drops. Supplying forward positions with food was a constant problem. An anti-tank detachment had a Kazan Tatar cook who filled a large army thermos with tea or soup, fastened it to his back, and crawled up to the front line positions under fire. If the thermos was hit by shrapnel or bullets, the hapless cook was soaked. Later, when the frosts became really hard, the soup or tea froze, and he was covered in icicles by the time he got back. With ill-defined front lines and a defense in depth of no more than a few hundred yards in places, command posts were almost as vulnerable as forward positions. Shells exploding on top of our command post were a common occurrence, wrote Colonel Timofey Naumovich Vishnevsky, the commander of the 62nd Army's Artillery Division, to a friend from hospital. When I left the bunker, I could hear submachine gun fire on all sides. Sometimes it seemed as if the Germans were all around us. The medical services in the Red Army were seldom regarded as a high priority by commanders. A seriously wounded soldier was out of the battle, and senior officers were more concerned with replacing him. Yet this attitude did not deter the very bravest figures on the Stalingrad battlefield, who were the medical orderlies. Mainly female students or high school graduates with only the most basic first aid training. The commander of 62nd Army's 100-strong sanitary company, Zinaida Georgievna Gavrilova, was an 18-year-old medical student who'd received the job on the basis of a strong recommendation from the cavalry regiment in which she had just served. Her medical orderlies, few of them much older than herself, had to conquer their terror and crawl forward, often under heavy fire, to reach the wounded. They then dragged them out of the way until it was safe to carry them on their backs.
They had to be both physically and spiritually strong, as their commander put it. There was no question of medical personnel being non-combatant. The beautiful Gulya Koroleva, a 20-year-old from a well-known Moscow literary family, had left her baby son in the capital and volunteered as a nurse. Serving with the 214th Rifle Division in the 24th Army on the northern flank, she was credited with having brought over 100 wounded soldiers back from the front line and killed 15 fascists herself. She was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Banner. Natalia Kachnevskaya, a nurse with a Guards Rifle Regiment, formerly a theatrical student in Moscow, brought back 20 wounded soldiers in a single day and threw grenades at the Germans. Stalingrad Front Headquarters also singled out, posthumously, the bravery of another female orderly, Kochnevskaya, who had volunteered for the front and carried more than 20 soldiers out of the firing line. Although she was wounded twice, she carried on bandaging and carrying officers and soldiers. The sacrifices of these medical orderlies were often wasted through the subsequent treatment of their charges. The casualties they carried or dragged down to the edge of the Volga were left uncared for until, long after nightfall, they were loaded like sacks of potatoes onto the supply boats, empty for the return crossing. When the wounded were offloaded on the east bank, the conditions could be even worse, as an aircraft woman discovered. The survivors of a disbanded aviation regiment who spent the night's sleep in woods east of the Volga awoke at dawn to strange sounds. Mystified, they crept through the trees towards the riverbank to investigate. There they saw thousands of wounded, as far as the eye could see, left on the sandy banks, having been ferried back across the Volga during the night. The casualties were calling for water, were screaming and crying, having lost arms or legs. The ground crew staff went to help as best they could. The former maternity nurse, Claudia Sterman, vowed that as soon as they reached Moscow, she would apply to transfer to a front-line medical unit. Survival was far from guaranteed, even reaching one of the score of field hospitals on the east bank of the Volga. Conditions in Red Army hospitals, despite the presence of some of the finest Russian doctors, made them seem more like a meat processing factory. The field hospital at Balashov, which specialized in arms and legs, some